The Ardennes in December 1944 wasn't just a war zone, it was a test of survival. I'm Harry Lang, sergeant in the 28th Infantry Regiment. Since our landing in Normandy, I thought I'd seen all the horror possible, until that German offensive that caught everyone by surprise. We were too young for that war. I was only 23 and commanded a small platoon of even younger lads. Some were barely shaven, but all carried the weight of veterans in their eyes. Winter had come early that year, turning the dense Ardennes forest into a white maze of snow-covered trees. Our position was at a strategic point, protecting a vital road that cut through the forest. We had dug foxholes in the frozen earth, set up defensive positions, and maintained a routine of patrols. The High Command assured us that the Germans were retreating, that sector was safe. What a fool I was to believe that. On the morning of December 16th, we woke up to the deafening sound of German artillery. The sky was still dark when the first explosions lit up the forest like hellish lightning. Corporal Miller, my radio man, was the first to spot the tanks through the mist. Panzer VI Tigers, the Wehrmacht's most feared machines, were slowly advancing between the trees. Our only defense against these steel monsters was a single M1A1 bazooka and 6 rockets. 6 chances to stop a column of tanks that seemed endless. Private Rodriguez, our explosives expert, had taught me how to use that weapon weeks before. Aim for the weakest point, Sarg, he always said, between the turret and the hull, or the caterpillars if you have no choice. The first Tiger appeared less than 100 meters from our position. Through the scope of the bazooka, I could see every detail of that deadly machine. The iron cross painted on the side, the marks of previous battles, the barrel of the 88mm cannon searching for targets. My men held their position, silent and disciplined, waiting for my command. The firing of the bazooka sounded like thunder in the silent forest. The rocket traced a line of smoke in the freezing air before hitting the tank exactly where I was aiming. The explosion wasn't spectacular like in war movies. It was a dull thud followed by sparks and smoke. But it was enough. The Tiger stopped, its turret immobilized, smoke escaping from the hatches. But we didn't have time to celebrate. A second tank was already advancing, its tracks crunching in the compacted snow. The sound of MG-42 machine guns cut through the air as the German infantry tried to flank us. My men responded with accurate fire from their M1 Garand, keeping the enemy at bay while I reloaded the bazooka. The second shot was more difficult. My hands were shaking from the cold and adrenaline. The Tiger was closer now, and I could see the commander's face through the open hatch. Our gazes met for a moment. 2 soldiers, 2 human beings, separated only by the insanity of war. I pulled the trigger. The explosion ripped the turret off the tank like a toy. It was a stroke of luck that the rocket must have hit the stored ammunition. The flash illuminated the entire forest for an instant, and the sound of the explosion echoed through the trees like a victory cry. The Germans retreated after losing the 2 Tigers, but we knew they would be back. We spent the next few hours fortifying our positions, distributing ammunition, and attending to the wounded. The winter seemed colder after the battle, the silence heavier. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, processing what had happened. That evening, sitting in my foxhole as the snow fell softly, I wrote a letter home. I didn't tell them about the tanks or the fear I felt. I just said that I was fine and that I missed them. The words seemed empty in the face of the reality we were living, but it was all I could offer. That was just the first day of a battle that would last for weeks. The Ardennes offensive, as it came to be known, would test every fiber of our being, every ounce of our courage. But that night, watching my men keep vigil in the frozen forest, I felt an indescribable sense of pride. We were no longer just soldiers. We were brothers, united by fate and the need to survive. The first few hours after the attack on the tanks were tense calm. We knew it was only the beginning. The morning mist was still hanging over the forest when I received the first news on the radio. The German offensive was much bigger than we had imagined. Entire divisions of the Wehrmacht had broken through our lines at various points. Miller, my faithful radio operator, was pale as he transmitted the messages. Sarg, the Germans have broken through the perimeter at Saint-Vith. The 106th Regiment has been practically annihilated. The news hit my men like a bombshell. The 106th was a new unit, full of young recruits who had barely experienced combat. I spent the morning reorganizing our defenses. We had lost contact with the company command, and the only information came through fragmented and confusing transmissions. Rodriguez, always attentive, helped distribute what was left of our ammunition, for bazooka rockets were all we had against the tanks now. The Germans are clever, commented Corporal Wilson, our most experienced sniper, as he cleaned his rifle. They waited for the fog and the bad weather. They knew our air force would be grounded. He was right. The low, gray sky was our worst enemy at that moment. Around midday, we began to hear artillery fire in the distance, getting closer and closer. The low sound of German 88mm cannons echoed through the forest like a dark omen. I ordered everyone to hold their positions. Every man knew that we were the only thing standing between the Germans and an important supply route. That's when we saw the first refugees. American soldiers, some wounded, others simply exhausted, began to pass our position. Their stories were all similar. Entire units surrounded, communications cut, commanders captured or killed. The chaos was spreading faster than the German troops themselves. "We can't let them pass like this," I said when I saw a particularly large group approaching. "We need every able-bodied man." I managed to convince about 20 soldiers to stay and reinforce our position. Among them was a gunnery sergeant called O'Brien, who would prove invaluable over the next few hours. O'Brien had experience with artillery observation and knew every inch of that sector. Together, we established a wider defensive perimeter, using the terrain to our advantage. The dense trees and rugged terrain could be our salvation if used correctly. As the afternoon progressed, the cold intensified. The temperature must have been well below zero, and the biting wind blew through our uniforms like needles of ice. I handed out what was left of our coffee and chocolate. It was little, but it helped to keep morale high. "Keep your eyes open," I instructed my men. The Germans like to send out reconnaissance patrols before the main attack. No sooner had I finished speaking than we heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through the snow. A German patrol, about 10 men strong, was approaching our position. Wilson was the first to spot the German officer leading the group. With a precise shot from his M1 Garand, he initiated the confrontation. The forest exploded in an exchange of fire. My orders were clear. Don't let any of them come back to report our position. The fighting was fast and brutal. When it was over, the snow was stained red, but we had achieved our goal. No German came back to report a location. Sergeant O'Brien examined the bodies, collecting documents and maps that might be useful. "They're from the 5th Panzer Division," he reported after examining the insignia. "One of their best armored units. That explains the Tigers we faced earlier." The information was worrying. If the 5th Panzer was involved, we'd be facing a lot more tanks. The next few hours were dedicated to further strengthening our positions. We dug new foxholes, set up cross-firing ranges, and created small ammunition dumps of strategic points. Every man knew exactly what to do if we were attacked again. In the evening, I gathered my sub-commanders for a brief meeting. The map that O'Brien had obtained revealed part of the German plan. They intended to use our road as the main route for their armor forces. Our small position had unwittingly become a crucial point for the whole offensive. "Tomorrow will be a difficult day," I said to the men before dismissing them. "But remember, every minute we delay the Germans here is a minute our forces have to reorganize. Every tank we destroy is one less tank threatening our comrades." That night, as I made my rounds of the positions, I observed my men. Some slept, others stood guard, all united by the same purpose. Fate had placed us there, in that icy forest, and now it was up to us to make a difference in that crucial battle. Dawn came with a disturbing silence. The cold of the Ardennes seemed to penetrate to our bones, but we maintained our vigilance. After the confrontation with the German patrol, we knew that the enemy would soon discover that their men had not returned. I ordered 2-hour shifts for each man, ensuring that we would always have watchful eyes in all directions. O'Brien approached me during his watch, offering me a cigarette. "Sarge, those documents we found, "There's something you need to see." He showed me a detailed map with markings in German. Even with my limited knowledge of the language, I could see that our position was at the center of a much larger operation. "They're planning a pincer attack," O'Brien explained, pointing to the markings. "They want to surround us completely. This point here, where we are, is crucial to their advance." The realization of the weight of our responsibility fell on my shoulders like a ton of bricks. Rodriguez appeared silently beside me, bringing bad news. "Ammunition is getting critical, Sergeant, especially for the machine guns." I made a mental inventory. For bazooka rockets, a few boxes of ammunition for the M1 Garand, and a few grenades. We'd have to make every shot count. Around 3 in the morning, we heard the first sounds of engines. Not tanks this time, but trucks. The Germans were moving infantry into attack positions. Wilson, with his experience, estimated at least a whole company preparing in the shadows of the forest. "Hold position," I whispered through the line. "No one fires until I command." Time seemed to drag on as we watched the shadows move between the trees. The moon occasionally broke through the clouds, revealing silhouettes of German soldiers taking up position. Miller crawled over to me with the radio. We had finally made contact with the command. The news wasn't good. No reinforcements available for the next 24 hours. We were on our own. The first attack came at sunrise. A volley of mortars fell on our positions, followed by a coordinated infantry advance. Our men responded with discipline, holding their positions and saving ammunition. Training and experience proved invaluable as each shot found its target. It was during that first assault that I saw something I will never forget. Young Phillips, no more than 19 years old, single-handedly took on a group of Germans who were trying to flank our position. With his Thompson, he held that sector until we could send reinforcements. When we reached him, Phillips was wounded but still firing. "I couldn't let them through, Sard," he said while our medic treated his wound. "I promised my mother I'd come home, but I also promised I'd do my duty." Those words perfectly capture the spirit of our men. The second attack was more coordinated. The Germans had learned from their first failure and now advanced using the cover of the forest more efficiently. O'Brien proved his worth again, directing our fire at the most vulnerable points of the enemy advance. "They're trying to tire us out," Wilson observed, reloading his rifle. "They'll keep up these attacks until we run out of ammunition or stamina." He was right, of course. It was a tactic we'd seen before. The hours dragged on in an endless cycle of attacks and counterattacks. We lost 3 men and had several wounded, but we held our ground. Every time the Germans retreated, we took the opportunity to collect ammunition and equipment from the fallen, redistributing it among our men. In the middle of the afternoon, Miller picked up a coded transmission. After deciphering it, we discovered that the Germans were planning a major attack for the evening, supported by tanks. Our final test would be 4 bazooka rockets against a determined armored force. I gathered my men to prepare our final defense. Each of them knew that the next few hours would determine not only our fate, but possibly the course of the battle in that sector. Tiredness was visible on their faces, but so was determination. "No matter what happens," I told them, "you are already heroes. Every minute we hold this position is a minute that saves American lives elsewhere." Those words seemed to renew their spirits, giving them the strength they needed to face what was to come. As the sun began to set, I watched my men in their positions. Phillips, even though wounded, insisted on staying on the line. Wilson adjusted his aim one last time. Rodriguez checked his bazooka, preparing for another clash with the German tanks. O'Brien studied the terrain, planning where each shot would be most effective. The distant sound of tank engines began to echo through the forest. Night was approaching, and with it would come our greatest trial. But we were ready, united, determined, and above all, prepared to defend that vital piece of land to our last man. Darkness became our ally on that decisive night. The sound of approaching tanks echoed through the frozen forest, but we maintained our discipline. With only 4 bazooka rockets left, every shot had to be accurate. O'Brien had identified the Tigers' most likely approach points, and we positioned our defenses accordingly. "They'll come in 2 waves," I whispered to my men. "First with infantry to make us reveal our positions, then the tanks. It was a tactic we had seen before, and our survival depended on not falling into this trap. Rodriguez stood next to me, bazooka ready. "Sard, if we miss..." I didn't let him finish. "We won't make a mistake." The confidence in my voice was greater than what I felt internally, but a leader can't show doubt at times like that. The first attack came exactly as planned. The German infantry advanced under cover of mortar fire, trying to force us to respond. Wilson, with his experience, advised our riflemen to hold position. "Let them get closer." His calm voice kept everyone focused. It was then that Phillips, still recovering from his wound, spotted a different movement. "Sard, they're bringing MG-42s. The German machine guns were known for their devastating rate of fire, capable of pinning an entire unit in place." I signaled to O'Brien, who was already coordinating our response. With surgical precision, our snipers took aim at the German machine gun teams before they could get a foothold. The sound of the M1 Garand cut through the night, and the MG-42s were silenced one by one. It was then that the first Tigers emerged from the darkness. 3 of them, moving in a triangular formation, their monstrous silhouettes jagged against the snow. Rodriguez and I positioned ourselves, bazooka ready. The first shot had a count. "Wait for my command," I whispered, watching through the scope. The lead tank was advancing slowly, looking for targets. I could see every detail of its armor, every battle mark. When it was less than 50 meters away, I gave the signal. The rocket cut through the darkness like a comet, hitting the Tiger exactly between the turret and the hull. The explosion lit up the whole area for an instant, revealing dozens of German soldiers approaching. The tank stopped, smoke escaping from every opening, but we didn't have time to celebrate. The other 2 Tigers opened fire, their coaxial machine guns sweeping over our positions. Miller was hit in the shoulder as he tried to reach the radio. "I'm all right, Sarge," he shouted, scrambling for cover. The second shot from the bazooka missed by centimeters, exploding behind one of the Tigers. Rodriguez cursed softly as we reloaded. There were only 2 rockets left, and 3 targets counting the tank looming in the distance. That's when Phillips did something that changed the course of the battle. Even though he was wounded, he managed to crawl to a more advanced position with a packet of explosives. "Cover!" I shouted, understanding his plan. All our rifles concentrated fire on the Germans who were trying to stop him. Phillips managed to plant the explosives under the tracks of one of the Tigers. The explosion didn't destroy the tank, but it completely immobilized it, turning it into a fixed target. Our third bazooka shot didn't waste the opportunity. The last Tiger, realizing that the situation had changed, began to retreat, but O'Brien had other plans. "Now, Sard, he's exposing the thinnest part of the armor." It was our last chance, our last rocket. The shot was perfect, hitting the tank at its most vulnerable point. The explosion was smaller than the previous ones, but just as effective. The Tiger stopped, its crew abandoning the burning vehicle. The German infantry, seeing their tanks destroyed, began to retreat. We kept up suppressive fire until we were sure they had completely withdrawn. When we finally lowered our weapons, the silence of the forest seemed deafening. I spent the next few hours checking every position, looking after the wounded, reorganizing our defenses. Miller managed to make contact with command, and reinforcements were finally on their way. We had managed to hold a position. Phillips, despite the new wound on his leg, was smiling as the doctor treated him. "You know, Sarge," he said, "I think I've got quite a story to tell my mother now." I couldn't help but smile too. That night had cost us dearly in ammunition, casualties, and energy. But every man knew that we had accomplished something extraordinary. 4 bazooka rockets, courage and determination had been enough to stop a far superior force. Watching the sun rise through the snow-covered trees, I reflected on how war turns ordinary men into heroes. Not out of choice or a desire for glory, but out of necessity and duty. Each of my men had proved their worth far beyond what any training could prepare them for. Dawn brought with it a different kind of silence from the night before. The wreckage of the 3 Tigers was still smoking, dark smudges against the pristine snow. As I surveyed our positions with the first ray of sunlight, I realized that we had lost more than just ammunition in that battle. The innocence of the youngest had dissipated like the morning mist. Miller, with his arm bandaged, still held his position at the radio. "Sergeant, I've made contact with the 7th Corps Artillery. They can cover us if we need it." It was comforting news, but I knew the Germans wouldn't give up that strategic position easily. O'Brien approached with an updated map. "The prisoners we captured revealed something interesting," he said, pointing to some markings. "The 5th Panzer is regrouping for a new attack. This time, they intend to use all their firepower." Rodriguez was checking our remaining arsenal. We had no more rockets for the bazooka, turning the weapon that had saved our lives into nothing more than a useless hunk of metal. The ammunition for the rifles was critical, and the grenades could be counted on the fingers of one hand. "How's Phillips?" I asked the unit doctor. "Stable, but needs urgent evacuation. The infection is starting to manifest itself." The young soldier had become a symbol of our resistance, and his courage inspired everyone around him. Wilson, ever observant, noticed the change in the enemy movement pattern. "They're bringing something heavy down the east road. I can hear the engines." The low, steady sound confirmed his suspicions as more tanks approached. I gathered my men for an impromptu council of war. Each of them carried the weight of the previous night in their eyes, but also a renewed determination. "We don't have a bazooka anymore," I explained, "but we have our position, our knowledge of the terrain, and above all, we have each other." The plan we developed was risky, but it was our only chance. We would use the Tiger's wreckage as ambush points, creating a deadly corridor for any force that tried to advance. O'Brien would coordinate with the artillery to maximize the impact of each bombardment. "If we can hold them off for a few more hours," said Miller, adjusting the radio with his good hand, "reinforcements from the 82nd Airborne will arrive." It was a race against time, and every minute was worth gold. I distributed the men in strategic positions, ensuring that each sector was covered. Rodriguez, even without his main weapon, organized assault teams with improvised explosives. "It's not a bazooka," he smiled, "but it'll have to do." The sound of the tanks intensified, and soon we could see their silhouettes through the trees. They were Panzer IVs this time, lighter than the Tigers but just as lethal. I counted at least 5 of them, supported by an infantry battalion. "No one fires until I give the signal," I ordered down the line. "Let them enter the kill zone completely." The plan depended on perfect timing. If we fired too early or too late, we would be massacred. The 1st Panzer entered the corridor we had prepared. I could see every detail of its worn paintwork, every battle mark on its armor. The commander was exposed in the tower, watching through binoculars. When the last tank entered the area, I gave the signal. The American artillery responded with devastating precision. O'Brien had calculated the coordinates perfectly, and the explosions turned our corridor into an inferno of fire and metal. 2 Panzers took direct hits, while the others tried to maneuver in the limited space. Our assault teams took advantage of the confusion to attack. With improvised explosives and grenades, they targeted the tracks and the most vulnerable parts of the tanks. The German infantry, taken by surprise, found themselves under crossfire from all directions. The battle turned into controlled chaos, exactly as we had planned. Each man knew his role, each position supported the others. Wilson, with his exceptional marksmanship, silenced any German officer who tried to reorganize his troops. That's when we heard the sweetest sound possible, the distinctive roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt engines cutting through the sky. The weather had finally cleared, and our Air Force was back in action. The fighter bombers swooped down on the German positions like angry eagles. The P-47 Thunderbolt attack marked a turning point in our battle, but not its end. As I watched the fighters dive over the enemy positions, I thought about how every moment of those last few days had changed us. We were no longer the same men who had arrived in the Ardennes weeks ago. The arrival of the 82nd Airborne was greeted with a mixture of relief and pride. When the major commanding the unit came to greet us in person, I noticed the admiring glances his men cast at my soldiers. Our small force had achieved what many would consider impossible. "Sergeant Lang," said the major, "your unit held a vital position long enough for us to reorganize our lines. You may have changed the course of this offensive." His words are kind, but all I could think about was the cost of that victory. Phillips was evacuated along with the other wounded. Before leaving, he squeezed my hand tightly. "Thank you, Sergeant, for not giving up on us." I watched the ambulance leave, carrying not only our wounded, but also pieces of our lost innocence. Miller, even with his injured arm, insisted on staying with the unit. "I could still operate the radio with one hand," he argued. His dedication reflected the spirit of all the men wounded not only in body, but determined to keep fighting. O'Brien spent the next few hours working with the command, sharing vital information about enemy positions and movements that we had observed. His knowledge of artillery and his understanding of the terrain proved invaluable for planning future operations. Rodriguez found a new purpose after we lost our bazooka. His experience with explosives made him essential in the work of clearing the mined areas that the Germans had left behind. "Every mine we defuse is a life saved," he said with a tired smile. Wilson continued in his sniper position, now training the new recruits arriving to reinforce our line. "Accuracy saves lives," he repeated, "both ours and the enemy's." His humanity, even after everything we had been through, never ceased to amaze me. In the weeks that followed, we received news that the German offensive had been contained. Our little battle in the Ardennes forest had only been one part of something much bigger, but every man knew that we had made a difference. Sitting in my foxhole for the last time before we were relocated, I wrote one last letter home. How to explain the transformation we had undergone. How to describe the weight of the decisions I had made, the cost of the lives that had been saved and lost. "War," I wrote, "is not about glory or heroism. It's about ordinary men forced to do extraordinary things because there is no other choice. It's about brotherhood forged in the fire of combat, about silent promises made on freezing nights." When we finally left our position, I took one last look at the wreckage of the Tigers. They would remain there, silent monuments to our battle, until they were eventually recovered, were consumed by the forest. But the memories, those we would carry forever. Years later, I met some of my men at veterans reunions. Phillips recovered completely and had 3 children. Miller became a radio operator for a commercial station. Rodriguez opened a construction company. Wilson continued to shoot, but only in sporting competitions. O'Brien, ever the strategist, worked for the Department of Defense, his planning skills being as valuable in peace as they were in war. Each went their own way, but all carried with them the lessons learned in that icy forest. As for me, I was never able to completely leave the Ardennes behind. Not because of the horrors of war, although they existed, but because of the transformation I witnessed in ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances. For the quiet courage, the unwavering determination, the humanity that persisted even in the darkest moments. This is my story, but it is also their story of the young men who became men in the frozen forests of Belgium, who faced the impossible armed only with courage and determination. It's a story about how 4 bazooka rockets, in the right hands and at the right time, can change the course of a battle. But above all, it's a story about brotherhood, about the power of the human spirit, and about how, even in the most adverse circumstances, we can find the strength in each other to overcome any challenge. The Ardennes changed us all, but it also taught us something precious. That true strength lies not in the weapons we carry, but in the men at our side, in the trust we place in each other, and in the determination to do what is right, no matter the cost.